They said the storm took everything from him, his wife, his hope, and the only warmth left in that cabin. But what no one knew was that it would also bring someone to his door who'd change everything. He sat there that night, holding a hungry baby, until a knock came through the thunder. Before we dive deeper, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories that touch the soul. It's late October in rural Oregon, and the winds already started howling across the pines. John Carson, a former firefighter turned woodsman, sits alone in his small, battered cabin. The storm outside rattles the tin roof so hard that it sounds like war. He stares at the empty cradle beside him, the wood chipped, paint peeling, the mattress damp from leaks above. 6 months ago, his wife Emily died suddenly, a heart attack in the very same storm season. Now John spends every waking moment trying to keep life together for their infant daughter, Lily, who cries all through the night. He knows the calls he once answered all his life as a firefighter: collapsed roofs, flooded cellars, people stranded. But tonight, there's no rescue team coming. The howling wind mocks him. Every clap of thunder echoes Emily's last breath in his memory. He rocks Lily, wrapping his coat around her like a shield, trying to block the cold as rain pounds the windows. His hands tremble not just from the chill, but from grief. Then, just as he's about to drift off, there's a knock. One sharp, desperate rap against the door. He freezes. His mind races. Who comes out here in this? No one does. He holds Lily closer, her small chest rising and falling, her little cries muffled by the storm. He stands and opens the door and sees a teenage girl, soaked through, holding nothing but a soaked blanket and wide, terrified eyes. "Her name is Mara," she says in a trembling voice. "My car, it went off the road. It's gone. Please, I have nowhere else." Behind her, the road is a dark nothing, tunnels of slash and rain. She looks younger than 18, but hard. John hesitates. Grief holds him back. But Lily's cry is louder now, urgent and raw. He steps aside. "Come in," he says. Over the next few hours, as the storm rages, John learns that Mara was driving home from visiting her mom in Idaho when the storm caught her off guard. She lost control on an icy patch, hit a tree, and rolled. She crawled out, bleeding, and walked until the storm swallowed the road behind her. John offers her a change of clothes, food, dry socks. She refuses water until she knows Lily is fed first. She watches John's careful, silent routine, heating food, bottle prepping, checking the windows, and doesn't speak much. At dawn, John wakes to find Mara gone. The chair she sat in is empty, the floor littered with a single muddy boot. He rushes outside, no footprints, no car, nothing but churned-up mud where her vehicle slipped off the road, hidden by fallen branches. For a moment he panics. Is she lost, hurt, dead? He searches for hours. Finally, he finds her in a hollow just downhill, wrapped in a blanket, unconscious, frostbitten. He calls for help. The storm has eased enough for a ranger to reach them by afternoon. Mara survives, taken to a hospital, treated for hypothermia and broken ribs. John stays with Lily in the cabin, wrestling fear and isolation, guilt and gratitude. Months later, Mara shows up at the cabin again, recovered. She brings a letter, Emily's handwriting. Emily and Mara had been pen pals in school years ago, long before John and Emily moved into the woods. Mara's letter says she's been sorry for years Emily passed so young, for the storms Emily wrote about that Mara never believed would be that strong. "I kept writing anyway because she listened," Mara says softly. That revelation changes John. He realizes that the storm didn't just steal Emily from him, it also set in motion a connection that Emily herself unknowingly arranged. Mara stays for a week, repairing windows, helping with firewood, and listening to John read Lily's bedtime stories in Emily's voice. It's the first time in months John feels something close to hope. At the end, John, Mara, and Lily stand together by the river, where debris from the storm still floats. twisted metal, broken branches. He pulls Emily's scarf from his pocket and lets it go into the current. He watches it drift downstream, past the damage, past the destruction, and vanish into a future neither of them expected. How would you feel if you were John, losing everything in a single night, then opening your door to a stranger who carried a piece of your past? And if you were Mara, walking through a storm with nothing but guilt and pain, finding in your path the person you once wrote to, but never knew? Does the storm take everything, or sometimes does it give back what we thought was lost? Let me know how this story made you feel, and where you're watching from, in the comments below. The storm had softened to a quiet rumble, the kind that hums deep in the walls. John sat in silence, rocking the baby in his arms, his mind still lost between memory and exhaustion. That's when the knock came again, softer this time, hesitant, like someone testing whether life still lived behind the door. He hesitated, the weight of the night pressing down on his chest. Then slowly he opened it. Standing there was a woman, drenched to the bone, hair matted against her face, her dress heavy with rain and mud. Her hands trembled around a small bag and a glass bottle half filled with milk. Her voice was fragile but clear. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, shivering. "My horse stumbled near your fence. I just needed shelter till morning." John studied her for a long moment, his instincts torn between fear and compassion. Her eyes, deep brown, carrying stories of sleepless nights and loss, held something familiar. Pain. He stepped aside. "Come in." She entered slowly, removing her wet shawl and glancing around the dimly lit cabin. "I didn't mean to intrude," she whispered, eyes settling on the baby. "I heard her crying outside." John nodded quietly, his throat tightening. "She hasn't stopped since her mother passed." The woman's face softened, the grief in his tone matching something in her own heart. "I'm Clara," she said after a pause. "Clara Reed." He introduced himself simply. "John." For a moment silence filled the room again, except for the faint whimper of the baby. Clara knelt beside the cradle, her soaked dress leaving damp prints on the floor. "May I?" she asked gently, holding out her hands. John hesitated, but something about her steadiness eased him. He passed Lily over, watching closely. Clara warmed the bottle of milk by the fire, testing it on her wrist, and began to feed the baby with slow, practiced care. Lily quieted, her small cries replaced by soft, contented breaths. John stared, unable to look away. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Clara said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of exhaustion. "Ma'am," he whispered, barely audible, "I think I have." For the first time since Emily's passing, the cabin knew peace. The fire crackled gently, and John's shoulders dropped as the room filled with the kind of calm that only comes after chaos. He found himself studying Clara, her steady hands, her quiet patience, the way she hummed under her breath as she rocked Lily to sleep. There was something about her, something buried behind her polite smile. As the minutes stretched on, Clara revealed small fragments about herself, a widow, traveling to find work in the nearby town. She'd been on the road for days, guided only by the hope of starting over. Her husband had died the previous winter, leaving her with nothing but memories and an old horse that barely made it through the storm. Yet there was something in her eyes John couldn't quite name, not just sadness, but fear. When the wind outside began to fade, John poured her a cup of tea and sat across the table. "You said your horse stumbled near the fence?" he asked. She nodded, staring into the steam of her cup. "Yes, he slipped on the rocks near the creek. I was lucky the fence caught me when I fell." Her hands tightened around the cup. "But it wasn't the storm that scared me," she added in a whisper. "It was what I saw in the road before I reached your gate." John leaned forward. "What did you see?" She hesitated, eyes glancing toward the window, as if afraid something might still be out there. "A carriage overturned. No horses, no people." Just a sound, like crying. But when I looked inside, it wasn't a baby. It was a photograph. She paused, her voice faltering. A picture of a woman and a child. The woman looked just like your wife. John's breath caught in his throat. The fire popped sharply, echoing the beat of his heart. He stood, his eyes darting to the mantel where Emily's picture once hung. Clara looked up at him, her face pale, her hands shaking now. "I didn't tell you before," she said softly, "because I wasn't sure if it was real. Maybe I imagined it, but something about that picture felt too close to this place." John's mind swirled with questions, but his body wouldn't move. Outside, the rain began again, slow, deliberate drops tapping the window pane like the ticking of time running out. Clara rocked Lily gently, her gaze distant, almost haunted, and in that silence, between the echoes of the storm and the soft breaths of the sleeping child, one thought grew heavy in John's mind. Who exactly was Clara Reed, and why did fate bring her to his door that night? But Clara hadn't told him everything, not yet. John stood near the window, watching as the rain softened into mist. The cabin had fallen into a fragile calm. Only the faint crackle of the fire and the slow breathing of the baby filled the room. Clara set down her empty cup and spoke softly, her tone steady but cautious. "If it's all right, I could stay for the night," she said, "just until morning. I can help with the baby, maybe fix a few things around here." Her words were gentle, almost hesitant, as though she feared she might be turned away. John hesitated. He'd spent months alone, every visitor a reminder that the world still turned while his own had stopped. But he was too exhausted to refuse. "You can stay," he murmured. "There's a cot by the fire." Clara smiled faintly, a tired, grateful smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved around the cabin with quiet purpose, gathering fallen blankets, sweeping the damp floorboards, folding the few clothes that hung near the hearth. She hummed as she worked, low, melodic, almost haunting. John froze when he recognized it. It was the same lullaby Emily used to sing to Lily before the storms came. He didn't say a word. He just watched. Clara seemed unaware of the song's weight, or perhaps she knew exactly what she was doing. As the fire dimmed and the night deepened, the world outside disappeared into darkness. For the first time in months, the baby slept soundly through the night, and for the first time in months, John allowed himself to close his eyes without fear of waking to silence. Morning came softly, sunlight spilling through the cracks in the shutters, the air heavy with the smell of oats and wood smoke. Clara was already awake, stirring a pot over the fire, her hair tied loosely behind her shoulders. Lily cooed from the cradle, reaching toward the sound of Clara's voice. John blinked in disbelief. The house felt alive again. The air didn't carry the same emptiness it had before. For the first time since Emily's death, peace felt possible, even if just for a moment. "Morning," Clara said, turning with a small smile. "I made porridge. Hope you don't mind." He nodded, his voice thick with sleep. "It's been a while since this place smelled like breakfast." She laughed quietly, handing him a bowl. "Then maybe it's time it did again." For a few minutes it almost felt normal. A man, a woman, a child, and a morning untouched by grief. But beneath that fragile calm, something lingered. Clara avoided his questions. Every time he asked where she was headed, or if she had family nearby, she would change the subject. When he mentioned the overturned carriage she'd seen, her eyes darkened. "Some things are better left behind," she said softly, almost to herself. Her hands trembled as she set the spoon down. "You wouldn't understand." John didn't press her, but unease began to coil quietly inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's arrival wasn't just chance. Over the next few days, Clara stayed longer than planned. She fixed the leaky roof, washed the linens, and filled the small home with an energy John hadn't felt since Emily's passing. Yet, every so often, he'd catch her staring out the window toward the woods, her gaze distant, her expression unreadable. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, he found her standing near the creek, clutching something in her hand, a gold locket. When she noticed him watching, she tucked it quickly into her pocket. He didn't ask, not yet. But when she turned back toward the cabin, the look in her eyes told him that whatever peace had settled there was only temporary. Clara smiled politely, but her voice trembled as she spoke. "You've been kind, John. More kind than most. But I should tell you, I wasn't just running from the storm." He frowned, unsure what she meant. She didn't elaborate. That night, she rocked Lily to sleep again, humming that same haunting lullaby, the one only Emily used to sing. And as the fire dimmed to embers, John found himself staring into the flames, wondering what kind of past could lead someone like Clara to a days drifted into one another like slow-moving clouds. The storm outside had passed, but inside the cabin, something deeper had begun to stir, a quiet companionship neither of them expected. John found himself speaking more than he had in months, his voice unfamiliar to his own ears after so long in silence. One evening, as the firelight flickered across the walls, he finally spoke of Emily. "She loved this place," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the old rocking chair by the window. "Said it made her feel alive, even when the nights felt too long. I promised her I'd raise Lily here, that I'd give her the life we dreamed about. But I wasn't fast enough that night. By the time I reached her, it was too late." His voice cracked, the pain raw but honest. Clara listened quietly, her eyes shimmering in the light. She didn't speak at first, only reached for the kettle and poured them both tea. Then, in a trembling voice, she said, "You're not the only one who's lost everything." She stared into the cup as though she could see ghosts in the reflection. "I had a baby too. Her name was Anna. She had the softest laugh, even when she was sick." Her voice faltered. "We couldn't afford the medicine. My husband, David, he tried to borrow money from the wrong people." She swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she spoke. "When he couldn't pay them back, they took everything. The farm, the animals, the little we had. He went out to beg them for time. They found his body by the river 2 days later. I buried them both in the same week." The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to dim, as though listening. John's throat tightened. He'd thought his pain was singular, unique, but sitting across from him was someone who had walked the same road, felt the same hollow ache. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "No one should ever have to carry that." Clara managed a small, sorrowful smile. "We all carry something," she said. "Some of us just learn to hide it better." From that night on, their connection deepened. They shared simple meals, laughter between moments of heavy silence, and long conversations that stretched into dawn. Lily began to smile more, gurgling softly whenever Clara sang. John noticed how naturally she moved around the cabin, tending to the fire, fixing the old kettle, even knowing exactly how to calm the horse when it spooked at thunder. It felt like she had lived this life before, long before she ever knocked on his door. Yet, the longer she stayed, the more small things began to unsettle him. When he mentioned the ranchers nearby, Clara knew names she shouldn't have. When he talked about heading into town for supplies, she quickly changed the subject. Once, when he mentioned seeing the sheriff about some missing mail, she flinched so sharply that she nearly dropped the spoon from her hand. John caught the movement, but said nothing. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing warmth between them. Some nights, after putting Lily to sleep, they sat by the fire, two broken souls mending each other word by word. Clara would tell him about her father's stories, how he taught her to ride and mend fences, how he said that storms cleanse the world for those who survive them. John would tell her how Emily believed love wasn't about forever, it was about moments. "And I keep wondering," he said one night, "if maybe this moment, you, me, Lily, is what she meant." Clara looked up, her eyes glistening. "Maybe it is," she whispered. The days grew gentler after that. The snow melted from the hills, and the cabin began to breathe again, light pouring through clean windows, laughter echoing where grief once lingered. To anyone passing by, they might have looked like a family finding their way back from sorrow. But beneath that fragile peace, questions began to stir in John's mind like embers beneath ash. Because as the days passed, something about Clara's story didn't add up. She spoke like a rancher's wife, but claimed she'd only ever lived in the city. She knew how to tend fences, saddle horses, and even recognized the scar on John's old fire axe. Something she couldn't have known unless she'd been near his town before. And every time he mentioned the sheriff, her face grew pale, her gaze distant. John didn't know what haunted her, or why she looked out the window at night as if expecting someone to appear, but the truth she carried was heavy, and it was only a matter of time before it found its way into the light. It started as whispers, the kind that drifted between coffee cups and church pews, carried on the breath of neighbors who had seen too much and understood too little. The storm had cleared, but in the small town a few miles from John's cabin, a different kind of thunder was rolling. They said a fire had burned through the southern ridge a week before, a family home gone to ashes, the husband found dead inside, the wife nowhere to be seen. Some swore she'd been seen riding north, soaked in rain and guilt. Others said she'd lit the fire herself. The story grew with every telling, until one morning a ranch hand rode through the town square with a new detail. The sheriff was looking for a woman in her 30s, dark hair, brown eyes, answers hidden behind silence. Said she called herself Clara, one man muttered, shaking his head, but no one knows her real name. By the time the rumor reached the post road, it had already turned into a warning, and warnings in small towns travel faster than forgiveness. John was chopping wood when he saw the rider coming, a dust-covered stranger on a chestnut horse. The man stopped near the fence, tipping his hat low. "You John Carson?" he asked. "That's right," John said, cautious. The rider's eyes flicked toward the cabin. "Heard you've got company up there. Woman, dark hair, about so tall?" He raised a hand to show her height. John's pulse slowed. "Why?" The rider leaned in his saddle. "Word is, she came from down south. There was a fire, house burned to the ground. Her husband didn't make it out." He paused, watching John's reaction. "Sheriff says she ran. Might be dangerous. Thought you should know." Then he pulled the reins and turned his horse toward the road. "Be careful who you let in your home, friend." When the sound of hooves faded, John stood frozen in the clearing, the weight of disbelief pressing against his chest. He thought of Clara's trembling hands, her sleepless eyes, the way she'd flinched at the sheriff's name. His heart said she was broken, not cruel. But the mind has a way of turning doubt into truth. Inside, Clara was feeding Lily by the fire. She looked up and smiled when he entered, but her smile faltered when she saw his face. "What's wrong?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He took off his gloves, placed them on the table, and spoke quietly. "Someone came by from town. Said they're looking for a woman who fits your description." Clara's hands went still. "John," she whispered, her voice shaking, "you have to believe me. I didn't do what they're saying." He took a step closer. "Then tell me what happened, all of it." Her eyes filled with tears. "I ran because I had to," she said. "There was a fire, yes, but it wasn't me who lit it. My husband, David, he'd been drinking again. He blamed me for everything we'd lost. That night, he said he'd rather see the house burn than see me leave. I tried to stop him, but he locked himself inside. I ran to get help, but by the time I came back..." Her voice broke. "It was gone. Everything, and they blamed me because I was the only one who survived." John stared at her, his mind a storm of disbelief and compassion. He wanted to trust her, wanted to believe the pain in her eyes was real, that the trembling in her voice came from grief, not guilt. But doubt had already settled in, quiet and cold. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked. "Because I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, maybe I could start over," she said, her voice cracking. "Maybe I could be someone else. Someone who—" The air changed that night, heavy, charged, and familiar. A new storm was crawling across the valley, the kind that carried memory in its thunder. John could feel it before the rain began, a pressure in his chest that whispered of the night Emily died. He moved about the cabin restlessly, checking the windows, feeding the fire, listening to the baby's shallow breaths. Lily had grown restless since evening, her skin burning with fever. Every small cry cut through the silence like a knife. Clara sat by the bedside, damp cloth in hand, whispering softly to the child. "You're all right, little one. You're gonna be all right." Her hands shook, but her voice never faltered. She rocked Lily gently, humming that same lullaby that once belonged to Emily, the melody that somehow soothed both the child and the ghosts that lingered in that small cabin. Outside, lightning split the sky, lighting the room in pale flashes. John watched her in silence, the woman the town had branded a fugitive now cradling the only piece of his world that still had life in it. He wanted to say something, anything, but words felt too small for the moment. Instead, he stoked the fire and prayed under his breath. The fever grew worse. Through the night, Clara stayed awake, wiping Lily's forehead, whispering prayers of her own. John sat beside them, caught between fear for the child and something unspoken for the woman who refused to abandon them. The storm outside roared like judgment, and he couldn't help but wonder if it was heaven's way of testing him again. By dawn, the fever began to break. Lily's breathing steadied, her tiny hand clutching Clara's finger even in sleep. For the first time in hours, Clara leaned back, exhausted, tears of relief glistening in her eyes. "She's strong," she whispered, "just like her mother must have been." John nodded quietly, a lump tightening in his throat. But before he could answer, the faint sound of hooves echoed through the rain, slow, deliberate, and growing louder. He froze. Clara looked up, eyes wide with dread. "They've found me," she said. Moments later, 3 shadows appeared through the mist, men on horseback, rifles slung low, badges glinting faintly in the pale morning light. The sheriff's men. They dismounted without a word, one of them calling out, "John Carson, the sheriff's orders. We're looking for a woman staying on your property." John's heartbeat thundered louder than the storm itself. He looked at Clara, pale, trembling, holding Lily protectively against her chest. "You have to let me go," she said softly, tears breaking through. "If they take me, they'll stop looking for you. Don't ruin your life for mine." But John couldn't move. His mind raced, reason screaming one thing, his heart another. He thought of all the nights she'd cared for Lily, the way she'd breathed life back into this house, the truth in her eyes when she spoke of the fire. He remembered the bruises she tried to hide on her wrists, the scars that didn't come from accident or guilt, but from surviving someone else's cruelty. He stepped toward the door, rain spilling in through the cracks. "There's no one here by that name," he said firmly. "You've got the wrong place." The men exchanged glances. One of them stepped closer. "You sure about that, John? Word says she's dangerous." John's eyes hardened. "So am I." The men hesitated, then turned their horses and rode back into the storm, muttering curses as they vanished into the fog. When the sound of hooves finally faded, John closed the door and leaned against it, breathless. Clara stood there trembling, clutching the baby tightly. Tears streamed down her face. "Why did you do that?" she whispered. "You could have handed me over." He looked at her, not with pity, but with a calm resolve that came from something deeper than reason. "Because I believe you," he said, "and because no one should be punished for surviving." The storm outside began to ease, the rain softening into a steady rhythm against the roof. Clara sank to her knees, sobbing quietly, as John knelt beside her. "He did it, didn't he?" he asked. She nodded through her tears. He started the fire. He said if I ever tried to leave him, he'd make sure I had nowhere to go. I barely made it out alive. She paused, her voice barely a whisper. And when I ran, I swore I'd never need saving again. John looked at her, the flicker of the fire reflected in his weary eyes. Maybe that's not why you came, he said softly. Maybe you weren't running to hide. Maybe you were sent here to be found. For the first time, Clara met his gaze and didn't look away. The baby stirred between them, the warmth of her small body grounding them in a moment that felt like grace. And in that stillness, John realized something he hadn't since the night the first storm took everything he loved. Maybe God hadn't sent Clara to test him, but to save him. The storm passed, not with thunder this time, but with a sound far gentler, the cry of a baby. Lily's fever had broken. Her small voice, once weak and fading, now filled the cabin with life again. Elias sat by her cradle, eyes glistening, whispering thanks to a God he thought had long forgotten him. For the first time in months, there was no dread in the morning air, only the smell of porridge and the soft hum of Clara's voice as she folded a clean blanket by the window. Word traveled fast in small towns. By sunset, the sheriff himself rode out to the ranch, his hat low, his tone humble. He'd spoken to a witness, a neighbor who saw the fire that night, and the truth had come out. Clara's husband had been a violent man, and the blaze that took his life was one he lit himself. When the sheriff tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am, you're free to go," Clara didn't smile. Freedom, after all, can feel heavy when you've spent too long running from it. That evening, the sky burned gold behind the hills. Clara packed her things, what little she had, folding each item with a quiet, practiced grace. Elias watched from the doorway, the baby sleeping in his arms. He wanted to speak, but every word felt too big, too final. At the gate, she turned to him. "I brought enough trouble here," she said softly. "You don't owe me anything, Elias. You gave me shelter when I didn't deserve it." He stepped closer, slow, deliberate. The wind carried his voice low and steady. "You brought milk to my doorstep when all I had was hunger," he said. "Don't think that was just coincidence." Silence hung between them, a silence thick with everything they couldn't quite say aloud. The baby stirred in her sleep, and a single note from a distant guitar broke the stillness. Gentle, trembling, almost like a heartbeat. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara looked back at the cabin, the place where ghosts had once haunted every wall, now warmed by the sound of a baby's cry. Music swells, soft guitar and strings, and for the first time, both of them understood. Sometimes salvation doesn't arrive as a miracle in the storm, but as a stranger who stays. A year passed, the kind of year that doesn't rush, but heals in quiet moments. The storms had grown fewer, the fields greener. And in the yard behind the cabin, a little girl named Hope chased butterflies under the warm light of a late spring morning. Her laughter rang through the open windows, brighter than the sound of any hymn. Elias leaned against the porch rail, his weathered hands no longer shaking when he held his coffee mug. Beside him, Clara knelt in the soil, planting new seeds for the coming season. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Every glance between them carried the kind of peace that only comes after surviving the worst together. The house, once a place of grief, now smelled of baked bread and lilac. The same cradle that had rocked through nights of thunder now sat empty in the corner, a symbol of what had been saved and what had begun anew. Sometimes Hope would reach for Elias's hand with her tiny fingers, tugging him toward the garden. "Mama says flowers grow better when you sing to them," she'd say. And he'd chuckle, that deep, quiet kind of laugh that only a healed heart can make. As the sun set over the plains, painting the sky in gold and amber, Clara looked out across the land, the place where she'd once sought refuge and found redemption instead. She whispered softly, "We made it, didn't we?" And Elias nodded, his eyes following the child dancing in the light. Then came the reflection that lingered in both their hearts. Sometimes the angels we pray for don't fall from heaven. They knock on our door, soaked and shivering, carrying a bottle of milk. And as night settled once more over the valley, there was no fear in the silence, only the steady, rhythmic sound of life continuing, of promises kept, and of love quietly reborn. Before this story ends, tell us in the comments, what do you think? Do you believe that people come into our lives for a reason? And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this remind us that even after the storm, there's always light waiting to return. The morning sun rose quietly over the ranch, brushing golden light across the fields that once drowned in rain. Hope's laughter carried through the open air, soft and free, the sound of a future untouched by sorrow. Inside the cabin, a small photo sat on the mantel, Elias, Clara, and the little girl between them, smiling. It wasn't a picture of perfection, but of grace. Proof that even the broken can be made whole again. He once believed the storm had taken everything, his love, his faith, his reason to keep going. But standing there, watching the light dance through the window, he finally understood. Sometimes the hardest storms aren't meant to destroy us, they're meant to bring us home. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think? Was it fate or faith that brought Clara to his door that night? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, give it a like and share it with someone who could use a little hope today. And remember, no matter how fierce the storm may seem, there's always light waiting beyond it. You just have to keep your door open long enough to see it shine through.